18 months ago, the man I loved looked me in the eye inside a sterile clinic parking lot and demanded his engagement ring back. The doctor had just pronounced me infertile, and his mother actually smiled as she threw my suitcases onto the street, calling me a useless, barren woman. Today, I am standing outside his $1 million wedding reception in Atlanta. And when I push these heavy oak doors open with a luxury stroller holding his triplet sons, the groom is going to drop his champagne glass. Before I show you how a so-called barren woman shatters a political empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe karma is best served in a custom-tailored emerald green suit. My name is Kiana, and I am 32 years old. I am a commercial real estate developer, but nobody inside this extravagant estate knows that yet. They still think I am the heartbroken girl they discarded like trash. The warm Atlanta breeze carried the scent of expensive catered food and fresh blooming magnolias as I stood on the grand front porch of the venue. The estate was a sprawling mansion with towering white columns and a driveway packed with luxury vehicles belonging to the city elite. I adjusted the custom sling secured across my chest where my youngest son slept peacefully. His two brothers sat wide awake in a sleek, black, double-designer stroller right in front of me. All three of them wore tiny tailored suits with matching gold bow ties. They were absolute identical replicas of the man standing on the other side of these doors. I could hear the muffled sounds of a jazz band playing softly inside the grand ballroom. I could hear the clinking of expensive crystal and the low murmur of high society networking. This was not just a wedding for Isaiah and Vanessa. This was a calculated political merger. Isaiah was 35 years old and running for city council. He needed the wealth and the clean traditional image that Vanessa and her powerful family provided. Her father owned a massive chain of private medical clinics, and Isaiah needed those deep pockets to fund his campaign. I knew exactly what was happening behind those heavy wooden doors. I knew Isaiah was probably standing on a stage right now holding a microphone and selling a completely fabricated story about family values and building a legacy. I placed my hands flat against the smooth wood of the grand entrance doors. My heart was not racing with sorrow or panic. It was beating with a steady, rhythmic drum of absolute power. I had spent the last 18 months working 18-hour days hiding my pregnancy flipping commercial properties and building an empire from the ground up while dealing with the sheer terror of carrying triplets alone. They had tried to break me when I was at my most vulnerable. They had thrown me out into the cold because I did not fit their perfect profitable image. Now I was back, and I was bringing the storm directly into their immaculate living room. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with a forceful shove. The heavy wood groaned loudly as the doors swung wide, revealing the spectacular scene inside. The ballroom was completely drenched in golden light from 3 massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of guests sat at round tables draped in crisp white linen and adorned with towering floral centerpieces of white roses and orchids. Banners for Isaiah and his political campaign were subtly mixed with the elegant wedding decor, because Isaiah never missed an opportunity to turn a personal milestone into a fundraising event. Right at the center of the room, on a raised white stage, stood Isaiah. He was wearing a sharp tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of champagne in one hand and a microphone in the other. Vanessa stood right next to him, looking like an expensive porcelain doll in a custom bridal gown that probably cost more than my first car. She was smiling that vacant, practiced smile of a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. The squeak of my stroller wheels crossing the marble threshold was surprisingly loud. The jazz band playing in the corner was the first to notice my entrance. The saxophone player faltered, missing a note, and then the music slowly died away completely. The sudden silence in the massive ballroom was deafening. Heads began to turn one by one, starting from the back tables near the entrance and rippling forward like a wave. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. My emerald green suit commanded attention, contrasting sharply against the sea of pastel wedding colors. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I kept my posture completely straight and my chin held high. I did not look at the political donors or the church elders whispering furiously to each other. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Isaiah. It took him exactly 5 seconds to realize who had just interrupted his perfect political speech. I watched the confident, arrogant smile completely slide off his face. His eyes widened in absolute horror as they darted from my face down to the baby strapped to my chest, and then to the two boys sitting in the double stroller. The crystal champagne glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the hardwood stage with a sharp, loud crash, shattering into dozens of sparkling pieces. The expensive liquid pooled around his polished shoes, but he did not even look down. He just stared at me, looking as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. Vanessa frowned, looking confused at her new husband, and then followed his terrified gaze directly to me. The whispers erupted immediately. The wealthy guests leaned into each other, murmuring rapidly behind their hands. The political elite of Atlanta recognized me. Some of them knew I was the former fiancé who had mysteriously disappeared 18 months ago. Now I was walking down the center aisle of a multi-million-dollar wedding, pushing a small army of children. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating, but I simply continued my steady, measured walk toward the front of the room. Suddenly, a figure broke through the crowd at the front tables. It was Brenda. Isaiah's mother wore an overly elaborate silver hat and a dress covered in unnecessary sequins. Her face was contorted with a mixture of sheer panic and deep-seated rage. She marched toward me, her heavy footsteps aggressive and hurried. Brenda had always hated me. She hated that I did not come from money, and she hated that I actually expected her son to treat me with respect. She had been the loudest voice calling for my removal when the clinic delivered that fake infertility diagnosis. She intercepted me halfway to the stage, blocking my path with her body. She leaned in close, desperately, trying to keep her voice down so the major political donors at the nearby tables would not hear her losing her mind. She reeked of cheap perfume and desperation. "What are you doing here, you barren, useless woman?" she hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the stage where her son was still frozen in panic. "How dare you show your face at this family event? Did you honestly think you could just waltz in here and ruin my son's perfect day with some random kids you picked up off the street? Get out before I call security and have you thrown out like the trash you are." She was shaking with fury, her hands clutched tightly at her sides. She wanted me to shrink. She wanted me to burst into tears and run away just like I had done 18 months ago when she tossed my belongings onto the sidewalk. She was relying on the power dynamic that used to exist between us. She thought she was still the powerful matriarch, putting a lower-class girl in her place. I stopped pushing the stroller. I stood completely still, letting her venomous words hang in the quiet air between us. The entire room was watching us now, waiting for my reaction. I looked at Brenda, examining the panicked sweat forming on her forehead. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt no heartbreak. I felt only the supreme satisfaction of knowing that the trap had been perfectly set and they had all walked blindly right into it. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to strip her of all her remaining dignity. I reached down with a calm, steady hand and gently adjusted the tiny gold silk bow tie on the son sitting on the right side of the stroller. He looked up at me with big bright eyes that were the exact unique shade of amber brown as the man standing terrified on the stage. "Barren," I asked, my voice smooth and projecting clearly in the silent ballroom. "That is funny, Brenda. You might want to look a little closer at these 3 exact replicas of your son." The shrill pitch of her voice echoed through the massive ballroom, hitting a frequency that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. It was the exact same pitch, the exact same venomous tone she had used 18 months ago. The sound of Brenda gasping and stumbling backward away from the stroller acted like a time machine, ripping me out of the golden light of the wedding reception and throwing me violently back into the sterile, freezing cold examination room of the fertility clinic. 18 months ago, the air had smelled of rubbing alcohol and bleached paper. I was sitting on the edge of a stiff leather medical chair, clutching a crumpled tissue in my hands. Isaiah was sitting in the corner, scrolling through emails on his phone, acting as if we were waiting for a routine dental cleaning instead of the results of our fertility assessment. We had been trying to start a family for a year before the wedding. Isaiah had insisted on it, claiming that a young, vibrant family was the perfect image for his upcoming city council campaign. The doctor walked into the room holding a manila folder. I can still remember the heavy silence that followed as she sat down and looked at me with an expression of deep, clinical pity. She spoke in soft, measured words, explaining test results and hormone levels and reproductive anomalies. But all I heard was the final, devastating conclusion. I was entirely infertile. The chances of me ever conceiving a child naturally were statistically zero. I felt the entire world collapse under my feet. A suffocating weight crashed into my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I turned to look at Isaiah, desperately needing him to reach out to hold my hand, to tell me that it did not matter and that we would figure it out together. Instead, I watched the man I was supposed to marry slowly put his phone away. He did not look at me with sympathy. He looked at me with an expression of cold, calculating disappointment. He looked at me the way a businessman looks at a bad investment. He stood up, thanked the doctor for her time, and walked out of the room without waiting for me. I stumbled after him, my vision blurred with hot tears. I followed him through the waiting room and out into the blistering heat of the Atlanta afternoon. The pavement was radiating heat, but I felt completely frozen. I reached for his arm as we stood beside his luxury sedan, begging him to talk to me. Isaiah turned to face me in the parking lot, and his eyes were completely empty. There was no love left in them. There was only ambition. He looked around to make sure no one was watching before he delivered the words that shattered my soul. "I cannot marry you, Kiana," he said, his voice flat and perfectly controlled. "A politician needs a family. The voters need to see a legacy. I am running on a platform of family values and community building. I cannot do that with a woman who cannot give me children. You are a dead end." I stood there paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of his words. I asked him if our entire relationship meant nothing to him. I asked him if I was just a prop for his political campaign. He did not answer my questions. Instead, he held out his hand palm up and looked pointedly at my left ring finger. "I need the ring back," he demanded right there in the parking lot while I was still sobbing from the diagnosis. "It is a family heirloom, and it belongs on the hand of a woman who can actually continue the family line." My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely slide the diamond off my finger. The metal felt heavy and cold as I dropped it into his waiting palm. He got into his car without another word, leaving me standing alone in the brutal summer heat to find my own way home. But the nightmare did not end in that parking lot. When I finally took a rideshare back to the house we had been renting, I found Brenda standing on the front porch. She had not even waited for me to walk up the steps. She had already packed my belongings into cheap garbage bags and thrown them onto the front lawn. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure self-righteous disgust. "Isaiah called me," she shouted from the porch, making sure the neighbors could hear her. "I always told him you were no good for him. You come from nothing, and you have nothing to offer. You are just a useless, barren tree taking up space in my son's life. Gather your trash and get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." I had knelt on the grass crying silently as I stuffed my clothes back into the torn plastic bags. I had never felt so small, so completely worthless, and so utterly discarded in my entire life. They had stripped me of my dignity, my future, and my self-worth, all in a matter of 6 hours. The sudden loud murmur of the wedding guests violently pulled me back to the present. The cold memory of the driveway faded, replaced by the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. I was no longer the broken, weeping girl on the lawn. I was standing in the center of the most exclusive venue in the city, wearing custom emerald green and holding all the power in the room. Brenda was staring at the babies in the stroller, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The resemblance was impossible to deny. The boys had Isaiah's exact jawline, his distinct eye shape, and the same slight dimple on their left cheeks. The undeniable proof of his paternity was sitting right in front of her, wrapped in matching gold silk bow ties. The shock finally wore off, and the survival instincts of a seasoned politician kicked in. From the stage, I heard heavy, rapid footsteps. Isaiah was rushing down the stairs of the platform, leaving his pale, trembling bride standing completely alone at the altar. His face was a mask of desperate fury. He was losing control of the narrative, And for a man whose entire career depended on public perception, losing the narrative was a fate worse than death. He marched down the center aisle, waving his hands frantically toward the back of the room. "Security!" He bellowed, his voice echoing over the hushed whispers of his wealthy donors. "Where is the security team? Get this woman out of here immediately." 4 large men in dark suits began to make their way through the crowd from the perimeter of the ballroom, but they hesitated as they approached the center aisle. You could not just aggressively grab a woman holding an infant and pushing a stroller, especially not in front of hundreds of high society guests holding cell phones. The optics would be a public relations nightmare. Isaiah reached the center aisle, stopping a few feet away from me. He positioned his body between me and the stage, physically shielding Vanessa and her wealthy parents from the confrontation. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project authority and dominance. He shifted seamlessly into his campaign persona, raising his voice so that every major political donor and church elder in the room could hear his fabricated defense. "I am so sorry, everyone," he announced, gesturing toward me with a look of manufactured pity. "This is a deeply unfortunate situation. This woman is a disturbed ex-girlfriend from years ago. She has been stalking me since our breakup, unable to accept that I have moved on and found true love with my beautiful wife, Vanessa." He turned to look at the crowd, making sure to make eye contact with his biggest financial backers. He placed a hand over his heart, shaking his head in mock sorrow. "I never wanted to air my personal struggles publicly, but she has clearly lost her mind. She hired actors or found random children off the street to come here and extort me on my wedding day. She thinks she can use fake children to threaten a respectable black man's rise to power and shake me down for campaign money." The crowd erupted into shocked gasps. Some of the older church members shook their heads, whispering about how tragic it was to see a woman sink so low. Vanessa's parents, sitting at the prestigious front table, glared at me with absolute contempt. Isaiah was playing the victim perfectly, wrapping his lies in the language of political persecution and righteous indignation. He was betting everything on his ability to charm the room and discredit me as a hysterical, unstable woman looking for a payout. He leaned in closer to me, dropping the polite public volume and hissing through gritted teeth. "I do not know whose kids those are, Kiana, but you are going to regret stepping foot in here. You are going to take your little rental babies and walk out those doors before I ruin whatever pathetic life you have managed to scrape together. You are nothing. You have always been nothing." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to scream over his lies. I did not need to defend myself against a man who was frantically trying to build a house of cards during a hurricane. I simply watched him sweat. I watched the frantic pulse beating in his neck. I watched the absolute terror hiding just behind his arrogant threats. I reached one hand into my designer bag, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The security guards took a cautious step forward, but I simply pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I held it up, letting the harsh light of the chandeliers catch the official federal seals stamped across the front of the document. I smiled, a cold, icy expression that made Isaiah physically take a step back. "I knew your political public relations training would kick in, Isaiah," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that cut straight through the murmurs of the crowd. "You always were so good at writing fiction on the spot. Good thing I brought some reading material to correct the record." I stepped around Isaiah, completely ignoring his physical attempt to block my path. He reached out to grab my arm, but I shot him a look so dark and filled with the promise of absolute ruin that he instinctively recoiled. I walked straight up to the head table. This was not just any table. This was the center of power in the room where the mayor, the chief of police, and the top real estate developers in Atlanta were seated alongside Vanessa's billionaire parents. I opened the heavy manila envelope and pulled out 3 separate thick stacks of paper. I did not hand them to Isaiah. I slammed them down directly onto the center of the VIP dining table, right next to a towering arrangement of white orchids. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the glass tabletop echoed through the silent ballroom. "These are federally certified DNA test results," I announced, my voice ringing clear and steady. "Conducted by a court-approved laboratory. You can read the methodology, the chain of custody, and the final conclusion on the last page of each packet. Probability of paternity is 99.9% for all 3 boys. The mayor, who was sitting closest to the document, slowly reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his reading glasses. Vanessa's father leaned forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he read the bold black ink stamped across the top of the pages. The murmurs in the room escalated into a chaotic buzzing noise. The pristine political image Isaiah had spent the last 18 months carefully constructing was cracking wide open right in front of his financial backers. That was when Vanessa finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The delicate, blushing bride persona completely vanished. She gathered up the massive skirts of her custom silk gown and practically ran down the stairs of the stage, her high heels catching on the heavy fabric. She pushed past Isaiah and charged toward the VIP table, breathing heavily, her face contorted with absolute hysteria. "This is a lie," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully through the microphone that Isaiah had dropped on the stage. She grabbed the certified documents off the table, her manicured hands shaking violently. "You are a pathetic, desperate gold digger. You forged these papers because you could not handle the fact that he chose me. You could not handle that he wanted a woman with actual class and a real family legacy." She began tearing the thick packets of paper. She ripped them over and over again, her chest heaving as she let the shredded pieces flutter down onto the polished marble floor. She looked around at the political donors and the church elders, desperately trying to regain their approval. "Do not listen to her," Vanessa pleaded, her voice cracking with frantic energy. "She is a fraud. She is just trying to extort us because my family has money and she has nothing. She probably paid some sleazy internet doctor to print these out. Isaiah told me all about her. She is unstable and she is lying." As if Vanessa's outburst was a signal, the rest of the toxic family dynamic kicked into gear. From the tables near the front, Isaiah's aunts stood up. Aunt Shirley and Aunt Beatrice had always treated Isaiah like he was a king who could do no wrong, while treating me like dirt on their shoes. They used to make backhanded comments about my hair, my clothes, and my career at every Sunday dinner. Now they began shouting over the crowd, pointing their manicured fingers at me in unison. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself coming up in here and trying to trap a successful black man," Aunt Shirley yelled, waving her hand in the air. "We all know your type. You saw him rising up in the world, getting his life together, and you decided to bring your messy drama to drag him down." Aunt Beatrice chimed in right behind her, nodding vigorously, making the large hat on her head wobble. "That is exactly right. You are just mad because he upgraded to a woman of substance. You cannot trap a man of God with fake papers and a stroller full of fatherless children. Take your little scam and walk out those doors before the Lord strikes you down for lying in a sanctuary of holy matrimony." The sheer hypocrisy of their words washed over me, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, deep satisfaction. They were showing the entire room exactly who they were. They were defending the indefensible out of blind loyalty to a man who had lied to all of them. I stood there watching the shredded pieces of the DNA tests rest on the floor like fallen snow. I did not need to defend myself. I had planned for this exact reaction. I knew they would try to discredit the paperwork. I knew they would try to call me crazy. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the bridal party lining the edge of the stage. It was Heather. She was wearing a hideous pastel pink bridesmaid dress that Vanessa had clearly chosen to make her look washed out, but the look on Heather's face was anything but subdued. Heather was a sharp, intelligent white woman who had married Isaiah's younger brother Malik 5 years ago. From the moment she entered this family, she had been subjected to the same toxic manipulation and backhanded insults from Brenda and the aunts that I had endured. But unlike the rest of the family, Heather saw right through Isaiah's golden boy facade. Malik tried to grab her arm to pull her back into the lineup, hissing at her to stay out of it. But Heather snatched her arm away with a look of pure disgust. She walked down the steps of the stage, her posture completely confident and completely utterly exhausted by the family's endless lies. The ballroom fell silent again as she walked directly toward me. She did not stop until she reached the VIP table. She slowly knelt down and picked up a torn piece of the DNA results that clearly displayed the laboratory seal. She stood back up and turned to face Vanessa and the furious aunts. They are not fake, Heather said, her voice carrying a calm, biting edge that cut through the tension. They are absolutely real. The crowd gasped collectively. Brenda let out a strangled noise from the side of the room. Isaiah looked like he was going to be physically sick. What are you talking about, you stupid girl? Vanessa screeched, stepping toward Heather. You do not know anything. I know everything, Heather shot back, holding her ground, because I am the one who sent her the DNA. 3 months ago, when Isaiah was staying at our house during the campaign tour, I went into the guest bathroom and pulled a clump of hair straight from his expensive monogrammed hairbrush. I sealed it in an evidence bag, and I mailed it via certified overnight delivery directly to Kiana's legal team for testing. Heather turned to look directly at Isaiah, who was now sweating profusely under the harsh chandelier lights. I have the tracking numbers, Isaiah. I have the receipts. I even have the security camera footage from my own hallway, showing me walking out of your bathroom with the brush. You have 3 legal biological sons, and the only fraud in this room is the man wearing that tuxedo. Aunt Shirley tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The political donors at the table were now openly whispering to each other, their expressions turning from shock to deep, severe disapproval. The chief of police leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and shaking his head. The church elders looked away from Isaiah, completely scandalized. Heather was not finished. She turned to the crowd, her voice rising with years of pent-up frustration against the family that had tried to break her spirit, just like they had tried to break mine. They threw Kiana out on the street the very same day the doctor told her she was infertile. They did not even wait 24 hours. They threw her away because she did not fit the political narrative. But she was already carrying his children, 3 of them. And while he has been up here playing the perfect Christian family man and spending Vanessa's daddy's money to buy a city council seat, Kiana has been raising his sons entirely alone. The truth hit the room like a physical shockwave. Vanessa stumbled backward, collapsing into a chair at the VIP table, her hands covering her face as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. Her father stood up, his face dark with rage, glaring at Isaiah with pure murderous intent. The merger was falling apart in real time. The perfect political image was completely destroyed. Isaiah completely snapped. The carefully maintained facade of the charming, educated politician violently shattered, revealing the desperate, cruel man hiding underneath. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged as he lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. "Shut up!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Heather. "Both of you shut up! This is a setup! This is a coordinated attack to ruin my life!" He turned his frantic, enraged eyes toward me. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had completely closed around him. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us, but my posture remained perfectly rigid. I did not flinch. I did not back away. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life?" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You think you can bring this trash into my wedding and tear down everything I have built? I do not care what those papers say. Even if those kids are mine, you will never see a single dime from me. I will bankrupt you in court. I will bury you in legal fees until you are living in a cardboard box on the street." He turned wildly toward the security guards who were still hesitating near the perimeter of the room. "Do your jobs," he bellowed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I want her arrested for trespassing. This is private property. This estate belongs to my wife's family. Security, throw this trash off my wife's property right now." The 4 security guards moved forward in unison, their heavy footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor of the ballroom. They were massive men dressed in sharp, dark suits with earpieces curled discreetly around their ears. Isaiah stood on the edge of the stage with a triumphant, manic grin spreading across his face. For a brief, fleeting second, he actually believed he had regained control of the room. He puffed out his chest, looking down at me, as if the presence of hired muscle would suddenly force me to shrink back into the terrified, weeping girl he had abandoned in a parking lot 18 months ago. He expected me to panic. He expected me to scramble backward to grab the stroller and run out the heavy oak doors in absolute humiliation, while the high society guests watched in amusement. I did not move a single inch. I stood my ground, keeping my hands resting lightly on the handle of the luxury double stroller. The babies were completely unbothered by the rising tension in the room. The youngest was still sleeping soundly against my chest, wrapped in the custom silk sling. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead security guard, who was rapidly closing the distance between us. I did not raise my voice or show even a fraction of fear. I simply lifted one hand, holding my palm up in a silent, effortless command to halt. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open once again. The sound made several guests jump in their seats. A tall, imposing man wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit stepped over the threshold. He carried a thick leather briefcase and adjusted his glasses with the calm, practiced efficiency of a man who destroyed corporations for a living. This was Mr. Elias, my lead corporate attorney and the architect of the financial guillotine I was about to drop on this entire gathering. He walked down the center aisle, completely ignoring the stares of the political donors and the frantic whispers of the church elders. He did not look at Isaiah or Vanessa. He walked straight up to the head of the security detail and handed him a single sheet of paper. The lead guard took the paper, frowning in confusion. He read the bold print at the top of the page, and then his eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked from the paper to Mr. Elias, and then turned his gaze respectfully toward me. He immediately stepped back, lowering his hands and signaling for the other 3 guards to stand down. They folded their hands in front of them, creating a protective barrier not for Isaiah but for me. Isaiah looked like he was going to have a stroke. The veins in his forehead were throbbing violently as he watched his commands being completely ignored. He gripped the edge of the stage, his knuckles turning white. "What are you doing?" he roared, his voice cracking with panic. "I am paying you to secure this venue. Grab her and physically throw her out into the street. I want her removed from my wife's family estate this instant. Do your jobs before I have all of you fired and blacklisted from every event management company in Atlanta." The lead guard did not even blink. He looked up at Isaiah with a perfectly neutral expression. "I am sorry, sir," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the massive, silent room. "But we do not work for you. We work for the property management firm that oversees this estate, and my orders come directly from the legal owner of the venue. We have been instructed to ensure this woman remains entirely undisturbed." Isaiah froze. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. He turned slowly, looking at Vanessa, who was shaking violently in her custom silk gown. He then looked at Vanessa's father, the supposed billionaire medical tycoon, who was sitting at the VIP table wiping a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead with a linen napkin. The illusion of their massive generational wealth was hanging by a very thin, fragile thread, and I was holding the scissors. I took a slow, measured step forward, the emerald green fabric of my suit catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. I looked directly at Vanessa's father, watching him squirm under the intense scrutiny of the room. "You really sold him a beautiful lie, did you not?" I asked, my voice smooth and projecting clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "You sold Isaiah the perfect political narrative. A wealthy, prominent family, a booming medical empire, and an estate that looks like it belongs in a magazine. It was a beautiful corporate merger. He gets your campaign donations to buy a seat on the city council, and you get his political influence to secure lucrative government contracts for your clinics." Vanessa let out a strangled sob, clutching her bouquet of white orchids, as if it could somehow protect her from the truth. The political elite sitting at the tables began to shift uncomfortably. The mayor adjusted his collar, staring intensely at Vanessa's father. The realization was slowly rippling through the room that they had been invited to a celebration built entirely on quicksand. But empires are so expensive to maintain, I continued pacing slowly in front of the head table, especially when your private clinics have been bleeding money for 3 years. Medical malpractice lawsuits, terrible administrative management, and a desperate need to keep up appearances in Atlanta high society. You ran out of liquid cash 12 months ago. You started pulling high-interest loans from predatory commercial lenders just to keep the lights on and the payroll funded. You kept smiling at these charity galas, pretending you were still on top of the world while your accounts were completely overdrawn. Vanessa's father tried to stand up his chair, scraping loudly against the marble floor. "Now listen here," he stammered, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "This is private business. You have no right to come in here and spout these ridiculous lies. I am a respected man in this community." "I am not spouting lies," I replied sharply, silencing him instantly. "I am quoting directly from your default notices. You were so desperate for cash to fund this lavish $1 million wedding and to funnel money into Isaiah's campaign that you made a fatal error. 6 months ago, you put this entire property, this beautiful historic estate, up as collateral for a massive commercial loan. You gambled your family's legacy on the hope that Isaiah would win the election and funnel city healthcare contracts back into your failing business. It was a desperate, pathetic gamble, and you lost." The entire ballroom gasped, the sound of hundreds of wealthy, influential people simultaneously realizing they were witnessing a financial slaughter was absolutely intoxicating. Isaiah stumbled backward, leaning against the podium on the stage. He looked at Vanessa, his eyes filled with sheer terror, as he finally realized he had not married into a billion-dollar medical empire. He had married into a sinking ship of massive debt and desperation. "You missed 3 consecutive payments," I stated loudly, ensuring the political donors heard every single word. The lender initiated foreclosure proceedings. The debt became a toxic asset on their books, and they put it up for sale to private investment firms. That is the funny thing about commercial real estate. When you default, your debt goes to the highest bidder. I gestured gracefully toward Mr. Elias, who unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick bound stack of legal documents, complete with the gold seals of the county clerk. "You all know my firm," I said, a cold smile spreading across my face. "You all thought it was a joke when I started it. Isaiah, you sat in my apartment 2 years ago and laughed at my business plan. You told me that commercial real estate was a man's game and that I was playing with pennies. You told me I lacked the ruthless nature required to build true wealth. Well, I learned how to be ruthless from watching you walk away from me in that clinic parking lot." I took the documents from my lawyer and tossed them onto the table right next to the shredded pieces of the DNA test. "My commercial real estate investment firm purchased your defaulted debt exactly 24 hours ago," I announced, the finality of the statement ringing through the air. "We paid cash. We executed the foreclosure clause immediately. This estate no longer belongs to your family. The deed was officially transferred to my holding company at 9 o'clock this morning. I own the ground you are standing on. I own the roof over your heads. I own the chandeliers lighting this room. You are hosting a wedding in my building, and your rental time is officially up." The devastation in the room was absolute. It was a masterpiece of total financial and social destruction. Vanessa collapsed back into her chair, weeping hysterically into her hands. Her father sank down beside her, looking like a deflated balloon, completely stripped of his pride and his power. The political donors, the men and women who had written massive checks to Isaiah's campaign, began standing up from their tables. They were quietly and quickly gathering their coats and their purses, eager to distance themselves from a massive public scandal. Isaiah looked utterly broken. The perfectly manicured politician was gone, replaced by a terrified, empty shell of a man who had just realized he threw away his actual children for a pile of worthless debt. He looked down at his polished shoes, shaking his head in silent disbelief. The walls were closing in on him, and there was absolutely no escape. But while the rest of the room was consumed by the shock of the foreclosure, someone else was rapidly calculating a new survival strategy. I watched as Brenda, Isaiah's mother, slowly stood up from her chair near the front. The aggressive, venomous woman who had just threatened to throw me out like trash was completely gone. In her place was a master manipulator desperately trying to pivot. Brenda's eyes darted from the legal foreclosure documents on the table to my designer suit, and finally to the expensive stroller holding the triplets. She had just realized that the woman she called a useless barren tree was now a multimillionaire who held the deed to the most exclusive property in the city. The gears in her head were grinding fiercely as she tried to figure out how to latch her claws into my wealth. Her face suddenly transformed. the hard, bitter lines around her mouth completely smoothed out. She forced tears to well up in her eyes, blinking rapidly as she pressed a hand to her chest. She took a slow, trembling step toward me, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet fake affection that made my stomach turn. "Oh my goodness, Kiana." Brenda cooed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She reached out her hands as if she wanted to embrace me. The sheer hypocrisy of her sudden warmth was staggering. The Lord works in mysterious ways, does he not? I was just so shocked earlier, I did not know what I was saying. I was just protecting my son. But looking at you now, looking at these beautiful, precious babies. She took another step closer, leaning down slightly to look into the stroller. Her eyes were gleaming with greed. "My grandsons," she whispered, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "My beautiful, perfect grandsons. You have done so well for yourself, Kiana. You have built such an incredible life. You are a strong, successful Black woman, and you brought our bloodline back to us. We are family, and family sticks together through thick and thin." She reached her hand out, attempting to gently touch my arm. "Isaiah is a good man." Deep down, Brenda continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were old friends sharing a secret. "He just got confused by these terrible, deceitful people. He got caught up in the politics. But you have his children. You are the mother of his sons. We do not need all this public drama. We can sit down, just the four of us, and figure this out. We can handle this quietly as a family." I felt a wave of absolute physical revulsion wash over my entire body. The audacity of this woman to stand before me after throwing my belongings onto the dirt, after cheering when my heart was broken, and attempt to claim my children as her family simply because I was now wealthy, was beyond comprehension. She did not care about the boys. She only cared about the power and the money they represented. I slapped her hand away from my arm with a sharp, resounding smack that echoed in the quiet space between the tables. I physically took a step back, putting an impenetrable distance between my children and her toxic, grasping hands. I looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Handle it quietly," I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Like how you quietly handled those medical records 18 months ago." The air in the ballroom seemed to turn to ice as the words hung suspended over the VIP table. Vanessa's father, a man who had spent decades cultivating an aura of untouchable medical authority and philanthropic grace, suddenly looked like a trapped animal. The sheer arrogance that usually radiated from his tailored posture dissolved into a puddle of raw, unmistakable panic. He stared at the thick manila envelope in my hand, his eyes tracking the logo of his own flagship clinic as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. I did not break eye contact with him. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating helplessness I had felt sitting in that freezing examination room 18 months ago. Back then, I had trusted the white coats. I had trusted the prestigious name on the building. I had believed the devastating diagnosis because it was handed to me by a professional in a sterile environment. I had no idea that my heartbreak was nothing more than a calculated business transaction. I unclasped the metal fastener on the back of the envelope, moving with slow, deliberate precision. The agonizing sound of the paper sliding out seemed to echo perfectly with the frantic jazz band trying to discreetly pack away their instruments in the corner. I did not pull out a single sheet of paper. I pulled out a massive stapled stack of internal financial records, highly classified emails, and wire transfer receipts. I turned slightly, ensuring that the mayor, the chief of police, and every major political donor sitting at the surrounding tables had a clear, unobstructed view of what I was holding. I wanted the people who funded Isaiah's campaign to see exactly what kind of foundation his political platform was truly built upon. You see, building a commercial real estate empire requires an incredible amount of due diligence. I began, my voice projecting effortlessly through the dead silence of the room. When my firm began acquiring the defaulted debt of your failing medical network, we gained full, unrestricted access to your internal corporate communications and your private financial ledgers. We had to comb through 3 years of your books to assess the toxic assets we were purchasing. I took a slow step closer to the table, my heels clicking sharply. Vanessa's father gripped the edge of the glass tabletop so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of blustering corporate defense, but his throat was too dry to produce a sound. While my forensic accountants were auditing your hidden accounts, I continued, my tone conversational, but dripping with lethal intent. They found a very interesting discrepancy. Exactly 18 months ago, right around the time Isaiah announced his intention to run for city council, your primary business account authorized a highly classified, untraceable wire transfer. I separated the top page from the stack and tossed it lightly onto the table right in front of him. It was a highlighted bank statement showing a massive transfer of funds. $100,000, I announced, letting the sheer magnitude of the number sink into the minds of the wealthy guests. $100,000 wired directly from your failing medical corporation into a private, offshore account. Now, ordinarily, corporate embezzlement is quite boring to me. But this specific transfer caught my attention because of the recipient. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Brenda, who was still standing frozen near the center aisle. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. The fake, tearful grandmother routine had instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. The account belonged to a newly formed shell company, I stated, clearly registered under the name of the head of the event planning committee for the First Baptist Church of Atlanta, a woman named Brenda. The collective gasp that erupted from the church elders sitting near the back was loud enough to shake the chandeliers. Several older women in the congregation stood up from their chairs, their faces contorted in absolute shock and disgust. Brenda stumbled backward, clutching her sequined dress, violently shaking her head in denial, but she could not speak. The evidence was sitting right there in plain sight. But why would a struggling medical tycoon hand $100,000 to the mother of a rising politician? I asked the room, pretending to ponder the mystery. It did not make sense. Until my team accessed the internal emails between your clinic administrators and the attending physician who handled my fertility assessment. I pulled out the next document. It was a printed email chain, the words sharp and undeniable. I held it up for the entire room to see. It was a beautiful, entirely corrupt merger. I explained, the cold rage bubbling just beneath the surface of my calm exterior. Your medical empire was bleeding out. You needed lucrative city healthcare contracts to save your business from total bankruptcy. Isaiah was rising in the political polls, guaranteed to secure a seat on the city council and eventually the mayor's office. You needed him, and he needed the massive campaign funding your family name could provide. There was just one small, inconvenient problem standing in the way of this perfect political marriage. I tapped my own chest with my manicured finger. Me. Isaiah was engaged to me, a woman with no political connections, no generational wealth, and absolutely no value to your corporate strategy. I looked back at Vanessa, who was staring at her father with wide, horrified eyes. She had genuinely believed this wedding was about love. She was a spoiled, oblivious girl who had been used as a pawn in her father's desperate attempt to save his failing business. So a deal was struck in the shadows. I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper with every syllable. Brenda accepted the $100,000 to facilitate the breakup and publicly discredit my character to the church community. In exchange, you ordered your clinic staff to falsify my medical records. You instructed my doctor to look me in the eye and deliver a fake diagnosis of total incurable infertility. You knew Isaiah was running on a family values platform. You knew he needed an heir to secure his political image. You handed him the perfect excuse to discard me, clearing the path for him to marry your daughter and solidify your corrupt alliance. The explosion of noise in the ballroom was absolute chaos. The political donors were standing up, shouting questions at Isaiah and Vanessa's father. The church elders were loudly demanding answers from Brenda, their voices thick with righteous fury. The pristine, elegant wedding had transformed into an active crime scene of corporate and moral corruption. Isaiah was leaning against the edge of the stage, hyperventilating. He looked at his mother, then at Vanessa's father, the realization completely breaking his mind. He had thought he was the mastermind. He had thought he was the one controlling the narrative, making the ruthless political decisions to secure his future. He had no idea he was nothing more than a puppet bought and paid for by two greedy, desperate families orchestrating his life behind his back. He staggered forward. His tuxedo jacket wrinkled, his face dripping with sweat. He pointed a shaking finger at Vanessa's father, his voice hoarse and frantic. "You paid my mother to fake her medical records. You set me up. You made me look like a monster." Vanessa's father slammed his hands on the table, finally finding his voice in the chaos. "I was protecting my investments," he roared back, his face purple with rage. "You needed my money to buy your election. You think you could have gotten this far without my family's name backing you. You are nothing without me." Vanessa shrieked, covering her ears as her father and her new husband began viciously screaming at each other right in front of the ruins of their wedding cake. Brenda was surrounded by furious church members, sobbing hysterically and trying to claim she donated the money to charity, a lie so transparent it only made the crowd angrier. The two families were tearing each other to pieces right at the altar. The polished, elegant veneer of Atlanta high society had been ripped away, exposing the rotting, desperate greed underneath. It was a spectacular, horrifying display of self-destruction, and I had simply provided the match to light the powder keg. I watched the chaos unfold for a few moments, feeling the immense weight of the past 18 months finally lift off my shoulders. The nightmares of sitting in that clinic, the tears I had shed in the parking lot, the endless nights of wondering why I was not enough, it all dissolved into nothing. I had not been broken. I had been targeted, and I had survived. But I was not quite finished. I did not come here just to expose a lie. I came here to burn their empire to the ground and salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. I raised my hand, snapping my fingers sharply. The sound was not loud, but the intent behind it was clear. The sharp, decisive gesture cut through the shouting. "If you think the real estate was the only transaction, you should see your own internal clinic emails." I announced, my voice slicing through the arguments and forcing the room into a tense, breathless silence. I looked at Isaiah, who was panting heavily, looking at me with a mixture of hatred and absolute terror. I signaled Mr. Elias, who was standing near the audio-visual control panel at the back of the room. The massive projector screens that flanked the grand stage had been displaying a continuous loop of Isaiah and Vanessa looking perfectly in love during their engagement photo shoot. With one press of a button, the romantic images vanished completely. The screens went pitch black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the entire ballroom with the harsh, glaring light of a high-resolution document scan. The sudden shift in lighting cast long, dramatic shadows across the terrified faces of the wedding party. The first document projected onto the 20-foot screens was a certified bank statement. The numbers were magnified so massively that even the elderly guests sitting in the far back rows could clearly read the transaction details. I pointed up at the screen, my voice echoing across the silent, terrified crowd. I told them this is a certified wire transfer record from the primary operating account of the Bride Family Medical Corporation. I explained that the amount was exactly $100,000, and the recipient was the Community Outreach Fund for the First Baptist Church of Atlanta. I turned my gaze back to Brenda, who was practically shrinking into the floorboards. I reminded her that she was the sole signatory on that specific church account, and that she had absolute, unrestricted access to those funds. I explained to the room that a $100,000 donation from a failing medical business to a church committee does not make any logical sense unless you understand exactly what was being purchased. Mr. Elias pressed the button again. The screen flashed and a new document appeared. This time it was an internal email chain. The header clearly displayed the official clinic email address of the lead fertility specialist who had diagnosed me 18 months ago. The sender was Vanessa's father. I read the words aloud, forcing every single person in the room to hear the absolute depravity of their actions. The email from Vanessa's father explicitly instructed the clinic administrator to intercept my blood work and alter the official laboratory results. It detailed exactly how to forge the diagnosis of complete irreversible infertility. It even included a drafted script for the doctor to use when delivering the fake news to Isaiah and me. Another email flashed on the screen showing Brenda replying from her personal account, negotiating the final price of the bribe, and promising to ensure Isaiah would end our engagement the very same day. She even included a cruel remark about how my modest background made me completely unfit to be a politician wife anyway. The crowd began to murmur their shock, rippling through the room like a physical wave. I walked closer to the stage, making sure Isaiah was forced to look at the screen. I told him that his mother hated me with a cold, clinical precision. I explained that she hated my independence and knew I would never be the compliant, submissive political wife she desperately wanted for him. But more importantly, I revealed that Vanessa's father needed a massive lifeline. His medical empire was suffocating under heavy commercial debt. He needed guaranteed city healthcare contracts to save his legacy. And Isaiah was the rising political star, guaranteed to win a seat on the city council. It was the perfect arrangement. I continued gesturing to the panicked, wealthy families at the head table. Vanessa's father buys his way into Isaiah's political future. Brenda gets the wealthy, high-class daughter-in-law she always wanted, and a massive cash payout disguised as a church donation. But I was the obstacle. I was the woman wearing the engagement ring. I explained that they could not just ask Isaiah to leave me because he had built his entire campaign on the image of a devoted family man. They needed a reason that would allow him to discard me while keeping his hands perfectly clean in the eyes of the voters. I watched the realization slowly wash over Isaiah's face. His eyes darted from the massive projected emails down to his mother and then over to Vanessa's father. For his entire adult life, Isaiah had believed he was the smartest person in any room. He thought he was the master manipulator, the brilliant politician who controlled everyone around him. Standing there on the stage, he finally realized the horrifying truth. He was not the architect of his own life. He was nothing more than a product that his mother and his father-in-law had negotiated, priced, and traded behind closed doors. Brenda began to sob violently, reaching out toward Isaiah, but he aggressively shoved her hands away. He roared at her not to touch him, his voice cracking with a mixture of profound betrayal and absolute rage. He screamed that she had sold his life. He accused her of faking a medical diagnosis to manipulate him into marrying a woman he did not even love, just so she could get a secret cash payout. Vanessa's father slammed his fist against the glass table, sending expensive silverware crashing to the floor. He bellowed at Isaiah not to act like a victim, his face flushed with absolute fury. He called Isaiah a greedy, selfish opportunist. He pointed out that Isaiah dumped me the exact second he thought I could not give him a perfect political family. He exposed the fact that Isaiah did not care about love or loyalty, but only cared about his upcoming campaign. He yelled that Isaiah was perfectly willing to throw a woman away to secure family money and influence, making him just as corrupt as the rest of them. Vanessa let out a piercing, agonizing scream. She grabbed the edges of her custom bridal gown and ripped the delicate lace in a fit of absolute hysteria. She turned on her father, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She shrieked hysterically that he had ruined her wedding and her entire life. She sobbed that her father had promised her Isaiah genuinely loved her and that their relationship was completely real. The realization that her marriage was nothing more than a corporate merger bought and paid for to save a bankrupt company completely shattered her reality. The high society guests were utterly horrified. The political elite of Atlanta, the wealthy donors who had written massive checks to fund Isaiah's campaign, were standing up and rapidly backing away from the tables as if the entire family had caught a contagious disease. I watched the mayor whisper something urgent to his aide before turning his back on the stage entirely. The church elders who had supported Brenda for decades were openly weeping and praying, shaking their heads at the sheer demonic greed that had just been exposed. Smartphones were out capturing every single second of the catastrophic implosion. The pristine elite image of two powerful Atlanta families was burning to the ground in spectacular fashion. The damage to their social standing and political aspirations was permanent and entirely irreversible. I stood quietly near the center aisle, perfectly untouched by the chaos erupting around me. The jazz musicians had completely abandoned their instruments and were staring open-mouthed at the screaming match happening on the stage. Isaiah was lunging toward Vanessa's father, having to be physically restrained by his groomsmen. Brenda had collapsed onto the polished marble floor, wailing and beating her fists against the ground in a pathetic display of manufactured victimhood. Heather stood near the edge of the room, looking incredibly vindicated, watching the toxic family that had tormented her finally get exactly what they deserved. My three sons remained remarkably calm, the soft ambient noise of the large room keeping them entirely undisturbed. The contrast between my peaceful, structured reality and their loud, messy destruction was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. I did not have to raise my voice to destroy them. I simply handed them the truth and let them tear themselves apart. The two families were viciously tearing each other to pieces right at the altar, ripping away decades of carefully maintained social status. They were destroying themselves with a level of ferocity that I could never have achieved on my own. I waited for a brief lull in the screaming before I spoke again, my voice slicing cleanly through the heavy, toxic air. "Do not fight yet," I said calmly, adjusting the silk sling where my youngest son was still sleeping soundly against my chest. "You are going to need your energy for the billing department." The entire ballroom was locked in a state of absolute paralysis as my words echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Isaiah stopped screaming at his mother and slowly turned his head to look at me. The manic fury that had consumed him just seconds ago was rapidly dissolving into a new profound sense of dread. He had thought the public humiliation and the destruction of his political marriage were the final blows. He had thought the worst was over. He was entirely mistaken because the financial execution had not even begun. I gave a subtle nod toward the back of the room. Mr. Elias, my lead corporate attorney, who had been standing quietly near the audio-visual equipment, stepped forward once again. He did not rush. He walked down the center aisle with the slow, methodical pace of a predator that had already cornered its prey. He carried a thick stack of legal documents bound in heavy blue paper, bearing the unmistakable raised gold seal of the state family court. The heavy rhythmic clicking of his expensive leather shoes against the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down the final seconds of Isaiah's ruined life. Mr. Elias bypassed the weeping bride and her enraged father, completely ignoring the chaotic mess of the ruined wedding party. He walked straight up to the edge of the stage where Isaiah was standing. Isaiah tried to take a step back, but his legs were shaking so violently he could barely keep his balance. Mr. Elias did not wait for an invitation. He reached out and pressed the heavy stack of legal documents directly against the chest of Isaiah's sweat-soaked tuxedo jacket. "You have been officially served," Mr. Elias announced, his voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. Isaiah instinctively grabbed the papers before they could fall to the floor. His hands were trembling so badly that the thick pages rustled loudly in the quiet room. He stared blindly at the front cover, his eyes darting across the formal legal jargon. He looked completely lost, unable to comprehend the massive tidal wave of liability that had just crashed over his head. I took a step closer to the stage, ensuring that the political donors and the wealthy church elders who were still lingering near the exits could hear every single detail of his financial ruin. "You spent the last 18 months building a very specific public image." Isaiah, I explained, my voice smooth and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather instead of his absolute destruction. "You went on local television and gave interviews about your massive success. You bragged on social media about your six-figure consulting salary. You gave tours of your new luxury home and proudly displayed your fleet of expensive cars. You wanted the voters of Atlanta to believe you were a profoundly wealthy, successful businessman." I paused, watching the blood completely drain from his face as the realization began to form in his mind. "The family court judge who reviewed my petition was very impressed by your public financial disclosures." I continued, smiling coldly. "When my legal team filed for child support, we did not have to hire forensic accountants to prove your income. We simply submitted a portfolio of your own campaign speeches and your own social media posts. You legally documented your massive wealth for the entire world to see, and the judge took every single one of those public statements into account when calculating your monthly obligations." Isaiah looked down at the paperwork, his eyes frantically searching the pages for the final number. When he found it, his entire body went completely rigid. He let out a choked, gasping sound, as if the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. "That is a retroactive child support mandate," I stated clearly, letting the words hang heavily in the air. You see, Isaiah raising triplets is an incredibly expensive endeavor. There were specialized medical bills for a high-risk multiple pregnancy. There were months spent in the neonatal intensive care unit. There is the cost of round-the-clock childcare specialized formula and medical monitoring. The court determined that since you are the biological father established by the certified DNA tests you tore up earlier, you are financially responsible for half of every single penny spent from the exact moment of conception. Mr. Elias stepped forward to clarify the legal mechanics, making sure there was absolutely no room for misunderstanding. He looked directly at Isaiah and spoke with brutal precision. "The amount you see on that page is not a suggestion," Mr. Elias explained. "It is a court-ordered mandate. Because you failed to disclose your dependents, and because you have actively flaunted significant liquid assets, the judge applied the maximum allowable percentage for 3 infants under the state guidelines. The retroactive arrears alone total hundreds of thousands of dollars payable immediately upon receipt of these documents." Isaiah began to hyperventilate. He clutched the blue-backed papers against his chest, shaking his head in frantic denial. "I cannot pay this," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. "This is astronomical. I do not have this kind of liquid cash sitting around. My money is tied up in the campaign. You cannot do this to me." Mr. Elias adjusted his glasses entirely, unmoved by the political candidate's breakdown. "Actually, sir, the court has already anticipated your lack of cooperation. The documents you are holding include an immediate wage garnishment order. Your consulting firm has already been legally notified. A maximum allowable percentage of every paycheck you earn will be automatically diverted to my client's accounts before you ever see a single dime of it." The sheer brutality of the legal trap was magnificent. Isaiah looked out at the empty seats where his political donors had been sitting just 20 minutes ago. The wealthy businessmen who were supposed to fund his rise to power were completely gone, having fled the ballroom to distance themselves from his toxic public scandal. He had no sponsors left. He had no wealthy father-in-law to bail him out. "But it gets much worse for you, Isaiah," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the stage. "You made a very critical error when you set up your political campaign. You mingled your personal consulting LLC with your campaign finance accounts to hide the bribes you were receiving from Vanessa's father. You thought you were being clever, moving money through shell companies to avoid tax liabilities. But when you mingle personal assets with campaign funds, you strip away the corporate protections that shield those accounts from family court collections." Isaiah dropped to his knees right there on the polished hardwood stage. The expensive fabric of his tuxedo pants tore against the sharp edge of a shattered champagne glass, but he did not even seem to notice the pain. He dropped the legal papers and grabbed his own hair, pulling at it in absolute despair. Mr. Elias delivered the final devastating blow. As of 8 o'clock this morning, all of your associated bank accounts, including your primary campaign fund, have been legally frozen by the state until the retroactive child support arrears are paid in full. Your credit cards will decline. Your business accounts are locked. You have absolutely zero access to your wealth. You are completely, utterly bankrupt." The silence in the room was absolute. The jazz band had silently slipped out the back doors. The catering staff had retreated into the kitchen. The only sound left in the massive $1 million ballroom was the pathetic, ragged sobbing of the man who had tried to throw me away like garbage. Isaiah knelt on the stage, surrounded by the shattered glass of his ruined celebration. The arrogant, confident politician who had tried to order his security guards to throw me out into the street was completely gone. He was stripped of his money, his power, his new wife, and his public dignity. He had absolutely nothing left but the expensive suit he was wearing. He looked up at me, his face entirely covered in sweat and tears. The defiance was gone, replaced by a desperate, groveling panic that made my stomach turn. He began to crawl toward the edge of the stage, moving on his hands and knees like a beaten animal. "Kiana, please," he begged, his voice breaking into pathetic, ugly sobs. "Please do not do this to me. I am begging you. This will destroy my entire life. My career is over. My campaign is dead. I will lose the house. I will lose everything." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the man who had abandoned me in a parking lot when I needed him the most. I felt absolutely no sympathy. I felt no pity. I just watched him beg, marveling at how easily his pride crumbled when his money was taken away. "Kiana, we used to love each other," Isaiah cried, reaching his hand out toward me, though he did not dare touch the fabric of my green suit. He was openly weeping now, the tears streaming down his face and dripping onto the stage. "You were my first real love. We had dreams together. We talked about building a life. I know I made a terrible mistake. I was just so pressured by my mother and by the campaign. I lost my way, Kiana. I was scared, but I loved you. I always loved you. Please remember what we meant to each other. Show some mercy. Drop the lawsuit. We can figure this out together. I want to be a father to my sons." The absolute audacity of his plea hung in the air. He was trying to weaponize the very love he had so callously thrown away. He was trying to use the children he had just called a fake extortion plot to save his frozen bank accounts. I looked at the 3 boys resting peacefully in the stroller and the custom sling. They were safe, they were secure, and they would never have to rely on a weak, pathetic man for their survival. I had built an empire to ensure they would never experience the cold rejection their father had subjected me to. I looked back down at Isaiah kneeling in the shattered glass. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips, cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. The sound was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the sound of a woman who had forged her heart out of solid steel. "You did not love me." "Isaiah," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying quiet whisper that carried the weight of absolute finality. "You did not even know how to love. You loved the aesthetic of success. You loved the idea of a perfect, compliant wife who would look good on a campaign poster. You loved the power and the money that Vanessa's family promised you. But you never loved me, and you certainly do not love these children. You are just mourning the death of your own ego." He continued to sob, covering his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently as the reality of his total, permanent ruin settled into his bones. The grand, elegant wedding had become his financial and social graveyard. And speaking of aesthetics, I continued tilting my head slightly as a new sound began to bleed through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. The faint, rhythmic wailing of sirens was growing louder rapidly, approaching the front gates of the estate. Red and blue lights began to pulse fiercely against the magnificent stained glass windows, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the walls of the reception hall. I looked down at Isaiah's tear-streaked face, a final chilling smile spreading across my lips. "The flashing lights outside are really going to ruin your wedding photos." The deafening shriek of the approaching sirens shattered whatever fragile silence remained in the grand ballroom. Through the magnificent stained glass windows that lined the walls of the estate, harsh pulses of red and blue light began to violently flash. The colors danced across the terrified faces of the wedding guests, casting long, frantic shadows over the pristine white tablecloths and the ruined floral arrangements. It was a chaotic, terrifying light show that signaled the absolute end of their reign. Isaiah remained frozen on his knees on the stage, staring blankly at the pulsing lights reflecting off the polished marble floors. The reality of his total destruction was finally complete, but the universe was not quite finished with his new family. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance were thrown open with a violent crashing sound. A swarm of men and women dressed in tactical gear and dark windbreakers flooded into the reception hall. The bold yellow letters on their jackets spelled out the acronyms of federal law enforcement agencies. They moved with swift, calculated precision, immediately fanning out to block every single exit in the ballroom. The high society guests gasped and backed away, clustering together in terrified groups as the federal agents took absolute control of the room. The lead agent, a tall, stern man with a silver badge clipped to his belt, walked directly down the center aisle, ignoring the ruined wedding cake and the sobbing bride. He marched straight toward the VIP table where Vanessa's father was still standing, frozen in shock. Vanessa's father tried to summon the arrogant billionaire persona that had protected him for decades. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his ruined tuxedo jacket, demanding to know the meaning of this outrageous intrusion. He yelled that he was a highly respected medical professional and that they had no right to interrupt his daughter's wedding. The federal agent did not even blink. He did not offer a polite explanation or a quiet warning. He simply pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs and informed the medical tycoon that he was under arrest for systemic healthcare fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and federal wire fraud. The sound of the metal cuffs ratcheting tightly around the wrists of the supposed billionaire echoed loudly across the room. Vanessa let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping to the floor and grabbing her father's arm, frantically trying to pull him away from the federal agents. She sobbed hysterically, begging them to stop crying out, that there had to be some kind of terrible mistake. Her perfect fairy tale life had just been violently ripped away and replaced with the horrifying reality of a federal indictment. That is when Heather stepped forward again. She walked over to the VIP table, her pastel pink bridesmaid dress swishing softly against the floor. She looked down at the weeping bride and the handcuffed medical tycoon with a profound expression of deep, unbothered satisfaction. "There is no mistake," Vanessa Heather said, her voice ringing out clearly over the sounds of the crying family. "They know exactly what you did. They know about the phantom billing codes. They know about the shell companies you used to hide the massive commercial debt. They know everything because I gave it to them." Isaiah's head snapped up from the stage, his tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure disbelief. He stared at his sister-in-law, unable to comprehend how the quiet, submissive woman he had always ignored could be the architect of this massive federal raid. "You see, Isaiah?" Heather continued, turning her sharp gaze toward the broken politician kneeling in the glass. "For 5 years, this toxic family treated me like I was completely invisible. Your mother insulted my background. You and your brother mocked my intelligence. You all thought I was just a stupid, quiet accessory who was lucky to be allowed at the dinner table. But the funny thing about being invisible is that nobody notices when you are watching them. Nobody pays attention when you are quietly making copies of the encrypted hard drives left carelessly in the home office. Nobody cares when you memorize the passwords to the private servers hiding the embezzlement ledgers." Heather smiled, a brilliant, victorious smile that illuminated her entire face. She explained to the horrified crowd that the DNA test she had mailed to me was just a small personal favor. Her true masterpiece had been spending the last 6 months working as a highly classified confidential informant for the federal government. She had meticulously gathered every single piece of evidence required to dismantle the corrupt medical empire that had funded their toxic, arrogant family. She had handed the federal prosecutors a flawless, ironclad case on a silver platter. The political donors sitting at the nearby tables suddenly realized the immense, catastrophic danger they were currently in. They were sitting in a room, entirely locked down by federal agents, actively watching the arrest of a major campaign financier. Their own reputations, their own businesses, and their own political futures were hanging in the balance. The survival instinct of the wealthy elite is a ruthless and terrifying thing to witness. The largest political donor in the room, a man who had just written a massive 6-figure check to fund Isaiah's city council campaign, suddenly broke away from the crowd. He walked with hurried, aggressive steps directly toward the stage. He did not look at Isaiah with sympathy. He looked at him like he was a diseased animal. The donor bent down and snatched the microphone right off the hardwood floor where Isaiah had dropped it earlier. The loud squeal of the microphone feedback pierced the air, commanding the attention of every single person in the ballroom, including the federal agents who were processing the arrests. The donor stood tall, squaring his shoulders and addressing the crowd, ensuring that the guests recording the scene on their smartphones captured every single word of his public denunciation. "My name is Mr. Harris," the donor announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "And as the chairman of the Regional Political Action Committee, I am issuing a formal, immediate statement on behalf of our entire coalition. We are absolutely sickened and appalled by the deep moral corruption and the horrifying financial fraud that has just been exposed in this room. He turned to glare down at Isaiah, who was still shivering on his hands and knees. Mr. Harris pointed a furious finger at the broken man. We backed you because you sold us a platform of family values and supreme community integrity. You looked us in the eye and promised to be a pillar of morality for this city. Instead, we find out you are a manipulative, lying opportunist who abandons his own biological children and conspires with federal criminals to buy an election. The donor raised his voice, ensuring his absolute detachment from the scandal was a matter of public record. Effective immediately, all political endorsements for Isaiah are permanently revoked. We are officially demanding the immediate return of every single dollar donated to your campaign fund. You are a disgrace to this city, and we will ensure that you never hold a position of public trust ever again. A chorus of loud agreements erupted from the other donors in the room. They clapped their hands and shouted their own denunciations, eagerly throwing Isaiah to the wolves to save their own pristine reputations. The political execution was brutal, fast, and entirely merciless. Isaiah buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly as the last remaining shred of his future was publicly incinerated. His campaign was dead. His finances were seized. His new family was being marched out the door in handcuffs. Brenda stood near the edge of the shattered reception, staring blankly at the horrifying scene unfolding around her. Her mind was completely failing to process the speed and the absolute totality of the destruction. She watched the federal agents physically escort Vanessa's father out of the Grand Oak doors. She watched the political donors aggressively disavow her son. She looked at the shredded pieces of the DNA tests, still resting on the polished floor. Her entire world had evaporated in less than 30 minutes. The generational wealth, the high society status, the prominent church position, all of it was completely gone. She realized with a sickening, terrifying clarity that she was about to be left with absolutely nothing. No powerful daughter-in-law to brag about. No successful politician's son to leverage for social capital. She was going to be an outcast, a humiliated, bankrupt pariah in the very community she had once tried to rule. Her frantic, terrified eyes darted wildly around the ballroom, desperately searching for any remaining lifeline, any single piece of value she could desperately cling to in the wreckage. Her gaze slowly shifted away from her sobbing, ruined son and locked onto me. She looked at the custom designer stroller. She looked at the sleeping infant resting safely against my chest in the silk sling. She realized that the only true wealth, the only actual legacy left in the entire room, was sitting quietly in front of the woman she had viciously thrown out into the street. A raw, guttural sob escaped Brenda's throat. Her knees suddenly buckled completely, giving way beneath the weight of her absolute despair. She dropped heavily onto the cold, polished marble floor, the ugly sequined fabric of her dress pooling around her legs. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, she began to crawl forward, moving across the floor like a desperate, broken beggar. She ignored the federal agents securing the room. She ignored the loud, frantic crying of the abandoned bride. She dragged herself across the marble, her hands reaching out blindly toward me. Tears were pouring down her heavily powdered face, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark, smudged streaks across her cheeks. She stopped a few feet away from the stroller, looking up at me with an expression of pure, shattered agony. She clasped her trembling hands together in front of her chest, pressing them tight in a gesture of absolute desperate prayer. "Kiana, please!" Brenda wailed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, ragged plea that echoed over the chaotic noise of the room. "Please, I am begging you. Have mercy on me. Those are my babies. Those are my beautiful grandsons. Please let me hold them. Let me just look at their faces. Do not take my family away from me, Kiana. Let me see my grandchildren before I lose everything. Please let me see them before my whole life falls apart." Brenda kept crawling across the cold, polished marble floor, her tear-soaked face turned upward in a mask of absolute pathetic desperation. She dragged her knees over the scattered, shredded pieces of the torn DNA test, completely ignoring the federal agents who were currently reading Vanessa's father his Miranda rights just a few feet away. The massive diamond rings on Brenda's fingers scraped harshly against the stone as she reached out her hands, trembling violently. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air as she stared at the luxury stroller. The sheer toxic entitlement of this woman to think that shedding a few desperate tears could somehow erase 18 months of calculated cruelty was staggering. She actually believed that her biological connection granted her an automatic all-access pass to the very same children she had ordered her son to discard like garbage. She pushed herself forward one final time, attempting to close the last few inches of space between her kneeling body and the front wheels of the stroller. She lifted her right hand, her fingers stretching out to touch the soft protective fabric of the canopy where my sons were resting. She never made contact. I moved with lightning speed, stepping directly into her path and planting my designer heels firmly against the marble floor. I positioned my body as an impenetrable physical shield between her grasping, greedy hands and my children. I looked down at her with a gaze so incredibly cold and completely devoid of any human sympathy that it made her instinctively flinch backward. I did not have to raise my voice. I did not have to shout to convey the absolute terrifying authority of a mother protecting her empire and her bloodline from a predator. "Do not ever try to touch my children!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy, chaotic air of the ballroom like a sharpened blade. "If you so much as breathe in their direction again, I will ensure the federal prosecutors looking into your $100,000 church embezzlement scheme add a permanent restraining order to your upcoming indictment." Brenda let out a wounded, whimpering sound, pulling her hand back to her chest, as if she had been physically burned by my words. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with terror, finally understanding that the power dynamic between us had permanently shifted. She was no longer the wealthy, untouchable matriarch, dictating the terms of my existence and judging my worth. She was a broken, bankrupted fraud kneeling in the spectacular ruins of her own making. There was no mercy left in me for a woman who had tried to destroy my future. Isaiah was still on the stage, watching his mother grovel at my feet. The former rising political star could not even muster the strength to stand up and defend her. He was completely paralyzed by the catastrophic sequence of events that had just annihilated his entire future in a matter of minutes. He watched me block his mother from the stroller, and the final crushing realization settled deep into his hollow eyes. He had lost absolutely everything. The political donors, the campaign, the luxury estate, the wealthy bride, and now the sons he never knew he had. I looked back down at Brenda, and then shifted my gaze to include Isaiah, making sure both of them heard every single word of my final judgment. The entire room, including the federal agents securing the perimeter, the remaining political donors, and the terrified wedding guests, fell completely silent, anticipating the final execution. The only sound was the distant wail of more police sirens approaching the estate and the soft breathing of my sons. 18 months ago, you threw me out like trash because I did not fit your perfect, flawless image. I began, my voice echoing clearly across the vast, silent expanse of the reception hall. You told me I was a useless, barren tree. You packed my entire life into garbage bags and tossed them onto the dirt because I was not politically viable for your arrogant, selfish ambitions. You thought you could just discard a human being and walk away without any consequences. You thought my silence meant I was defeated. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the heavy, absolute weight of the moment anchor itself into their shattered minds. I wanted them to remember this exact second for the rest of their miserable lives. Today, I bought your luxury venue out from under you. I continued, stating the facts with brutal surgical precision. I bankrupted your political campaign before you even made it to the ballot box. I tied your personal finances into a knot of retroactive child support that you will never ever be able to escape. And I stood right here in my custom green suit and watched your corrupt corporate empire fall directly into the hands of federal agents. I did not have to lift a finger to destroy you. I simply handed the world the truth and watched you destroy yourselves. I paused, looking down at the three tiny boys who were beginning to stir slightly in the stroller. Their soft, peaceful movements, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the loud, messy destruction surrounding them. I gently adjusted the silk sling, holding my youngest son, making sure he was perfectly secure against my chest. They were completely insulated from the toxicity of the people kneeling before us. As for these kids, I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register that left absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. They have my last name. They will only ever know my last name. You will never get to use them as props for your political campaigns. You will never get to post photos of them to pretend you are a loving, devoted grandmother. You will not get joint custody. You will not get weekend visits. You will not even get a supervised holiday dinner. I leaned down just slightly, ensuring Brenda and Isaiah could look directly into my eyes as I delivered the final, unalterable boundary that would define the rest of their existence. None of you will ever get within 100 feet of them for the rest of your ruined lives. I promise the absolute certainty of my words, locking the door on their future forever. This is my empire now, and you are permanently exiled from it. Brenda let out a loud, agonizing wail, collapsing fully onto the marble floor and covering her head with her trembling arms. She wept with the profound, bottomless grief of a woman who had just realized she traded her actual legacy for a handful of stolen campaign money and a fake high society image. On the stage, Isaiah buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he finally accepted the magnitude of his losses. He would spend the rest of his life paying for children he would never be allowed to meet while working off debts he could never satisfy. I did not wait for them to offer any more pathetic apologies. I did not need to hear another lying word from the people who had tried to break my spirit. The debt had been paid in full, and the account was permanently closed. I turned my back on them smoothly, gripping the handle of the luxury double stroller. I did not rush. I did not look back. I began my walk down the center aisle, moving with the exact same calm, steady pacing that I had used when I first entered the ballroom. The emerald green fabric of my suit swayed gracefully with each confident, powerful step. As I walked past the VIP tables, the remaining high society guests parted like the Red Sea, giving me a wide, respectful berth. The political donors who had mocked me and whispered about me earlier now looked at me with a mixture of absolute fear and undeniable awe. The mayor, who was quietly speaking to his legal counsel, refused to meet my eyes. The chief of police gave a slow, respectful nod as I passed, acknowledging the sheer tactical brilliance of the trap I had sprung. The federal agents who were busy securing the exits and reading Miranda rights to Vanessa's screaming relatives stepped aside to let me through completely undisturbed. I caught sight of Heather standing near the back wall. She was watching me leave, a quiet, victorious smile playing on her lips. She looked completely unburdened, having finally freed herself from the suffocating weight of her toxic in-laws. She gave me a subtle, approving nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of our coordinated takedown. I returned the nod, a silent promise that her loyalty and her incredible bravery would be heavily rewarded in the very near future. I reached the massive, grand oak doors at the entrance of the estate. Mr. Elias, my brilliant corporate attorney, was already standing there, waiting for me with his briefcase secured. He pushed the heavy wooden doors open, letting the warm, fragrant air of the Atlanta evening sweep into the chaotic, breathless ballroom. The night air smelled of rain and blooming magnolias, a clean, fresh scent that immediately washed away the stale, toxic atmosphere of the wedding reception. I stepped over the threshold and walked out onto the grand front porch, leaving the flashing red and blue police lights, the frantic sobbing, and the harsh metallic sounds of handcuffs far behind me. I walked down the wide stone steps, moving toward the waiting fleet of black luxury SUVs that my firm had arranged for my departure. I held my head incredibly high, breathing in the sweet scent of freedom. The heavy, suffocating weight of the past 18 months, the fear, the exhaustion, the endless grinding nights was completely gone. I was untouched, untouchable, and entirely victorious. The chaotic sounds of the ruined wedding of the screaming bride and the arrested billionaires began to fade away, melting into the warm southern night as the heavy oak doors shut firmly behind me. 3 weeks passed since that night. The heavy, suffocating heat of the Atlanta summer slowly gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The massive explosion that had decimated the lives of the people who tried to destroy me was no longer a frantic, chaotic mess. The dust had finally begun to settle over the city, leaving behind a beautifully quiet and perfectly structured reality. I did not have to lift a single finger to keep the momentum going, because the natural consequences of their own arrogance did all the heavy lifting for me. The local news networks and the high society gossip columns fed on the ruins of their empire for weeks, turning their spectacular downfall into the most consumed media spectacle of the year. Every time I opened a business journal or scrolled through the morning headlines on my tablet, there was another detailed article exposing the absolute collapse of Vanessa's family. The federal prosecutors did not offer them a single shred of leniency. The government investigators brought down the hammer with a ruthless efficiency that completely dismantled the fraudulent medical network piece by piece. They seized every asset, every private clinic, and every piece of commercial property connected to the embezzlement scheme. The fleet of luxury cars, the vacation homes, the offshore accounts. Everything was frozen and confiscated. Vanessa's father, the man who had looked at me with such overwhelming disgust, was denied bail. He was currently sitting in a federal holding cell wearing a standard issue uniform, staring down the horrifying reality of spending the next 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Vanessa herself was photographed by the paparazzi, moving out of her luxury penthouse. She was carrying a few hastily packed cardboard boxes, looking completely unrecognizable without her expensive designer wardrobe and her wealthy entourage. Her fairy tale wedding had legally never even been finalized, because the ceremony was interrupted before the paperwork was signed. She walked away from the entire disaster with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and a permanently destroyed reputation. Brenda's social execution was almost surgical in its precision. The First Baptist Church of Atlanta convened an emergency disciplinary board the very morning after the wedding raid. They stripped her of her title as the head of the event planning committee and formally revoked her membership, citing a profound breach of moral and financial trust. The women who used to hang on her every word, the same wealthy church ladies who used to sit at Sunday dinner and mock my background, completely erased her from their social circles. They blocked her phone number and refused to acknowledge her existence if they happened to pass her on the street. She was forced to put her heavily mortgaged suburban house on the market just to pay the massive retainer for a cheap local defense attorney. The last time anyone saw her, she was working the checkout register at a discount grocery store on the far outskirts of the city. People said she kept her head down, staring at the linoleum floor and hiding her face whenever someone from the old neighborhood walked through the automatic sliding doors. The matriarch who had thrown my suitcases onto the lawn was now scanning canned goods for minimum wage living in a constant state of public humiliation. But the most spectacular and satisfying downfall belonged entirely to Isaiah. His political career was dead and buried before the polls even opened. The Regional Political Action Committee officially blacklisted his name from every major donor list in the state. Without the campaign funds to hide behind, the brutal reality of the family court mandate crashed down on his personal finances like a concrete block. The retroactive child support payments for the triplets triggered an immediate maximum wage garnishment that completely drained his remaining liquid assets. He could no longer afford the exorbitant monthly payments on his luxury vehicles, so the bank repossessed his sleek black sedan right out of his driveway in the middle of the afternoon. His prestigious consulting firm quietly terminated his contract, stating that his presence was a toxic liability to their corporate image. With his law license officially suspended pending the federal investigation into his campaign finances, he had absolutely no professional options left. The man who had abandoned me in a parking lot because he needed a wealthy political wife was now working a low-level data entry desk job at a logistics company just to keep a roof over his head. Every other Friday, a massive percentage of his modest paycheck was automatically routed directly into a secure trust fund managed by my financial team. The legal system ensured that my sons would benefit from his labor, while he lived in a cramped studio apartment, taking the public bus to work and struggling to afford basic groceries. He had tried to call my corporate office twice, begging to speak with me, begging for a reduction in the payments. But Mr. Elias handled the calls with flawless legal hostility, reminding Isaiah that any further contact would be classified as harassment. He was trapped in a financial prison of his own making, and there was no way out. The contrast between their total absolute ruin and my daily existence was like comparing night and day. I had insulated myself and my children entirely from the toxic wreckage of their lives. My mornings did not start with frantic calls from defense attorneys or panicked visits from aggressive debt collectors. My mornings started with the soft, warm light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury penthouse. I would sit on the plush, hypoallergenic nursery rug, surrounded by the soft, happy sounds of my 3 sons waking up. The boys were thriving, growing stronger, and more intensely curious with every passing day. They had my ambition and my resilience flowing through their veins. I had hired a team of highly vetted professional nannies and pediatric nurses to assist me, but I never compromised my personal time with them. I built my entire corporate schedule around their feeding and sleeping needs, ensuring that I was always the constant, steady presence in their lives. They had a secure, loving environment filled with laughter and absolute peace. They would never know the cold, calculating, conditional love that their biological father and grandmother had tried to force upon me. They would never hear the words useless or barren. They would only know the unyielding protective devotion of a mother who had burned an entire corrupt empire to the ground just to ensure they had a safe place to sleep. I had taken the agonizing pain of the past 18 months and transformed it into an impenetrable fortress of generational wealth and emotional security. My professional life was expanding at an exponential rate. The commercial real estate investment firm I had built from nothing was now recognized as one of the most formidable entities in the southern United States. The acquisition of the historic estate where the ruined wedding took place had been a massive financial victory. My team had immediately rebranded the property, turning it into a premier corporate retreat, an exclusive event space that was already fully booked for the next 2 years. The irony that the very ground where Isaiah tried to banish me was now generating millions of dollars in pure profit for my holding company was a daily source of deep, quiet satisfaction. I sat at my desk on a crisp Tuesday morning, reviewing the architectural blueprints for a new commercial plaza we were developing in Midtown. My corner office was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring sleek glass walls, polished dark wood accents, and a breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. It was a physical manifestation of my independence. A private soundproof nursery was attached to the office through a discreet side door, allowing me to transition seamlessly between high-stakes board meetings and spending quiet moments with my sons. Everything in my world was finally perfectly aligned. There was no drama, no manipulation, and absolutely no toxicity allowed past the front reception desk. I took a sip of my black coffee, enjoying the smooth, bitter taste as I analyzed the profit margins on the blueprint. The intercom on my desk chimed softly, breaking the quiet focus of the room. It was my executive assistant, a highly efficient woman who managed my schedule with absolute precision. "Mrs. Kiana?" she said, her voice carrying through the small speaker. "I apologize for the interruption, but there is a woman here to see you. She does not have an appointment, but she stated that it was a personal matter of some importance. She says she knows you from the estate acquisition last month." I frowned slightly, setting my pen down on the glass desk. I did not take unscheduled meetings. My time was fiercely protected, and anyone connected to the wedding disaster was strictly forbidden from accessing my corporate floor. My security protocols were flawless, so the fact that she had made it to the executive reception area meant she had passed the initial background screening downstairs. "Who is it?" I asked, keeping my tone even and professional. "She gave her name as Heather," my assistant replied. "She said to tell you she brought the updated tracking receipts." The mention of the tracking receipts immediately cleared the confusion from my mind. A genuine smile broke across my face, replacing the stern corporate mask I usually wore during business hours. Heather was the sharp, intelligent woman who had handed me the final nail for Isaiah's coffin. She was the inside ally who had risked everything to tear down the toxic family that had tried to destroy us both. She had walked out of that ballroom with her head held high, and I had not spoken to her since the night of the raid. "Send her in immediately," I instructed, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair. "And please hold all of my calls for the next hour." The heavy glass door to my office opened a few moments later. Heather stepped into the room, looking completely different than the stressed, exhausted woman I had seen wearing that hideous pastel pink bridesmaid dress. She was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue business suit, her hair styled in a sleek, professional cut. The dark circles under her eyes were completely gone, replaced by a bright, clear energy that radiated absolute freedom. She looked around the massive corner office, taking in the panoramic skyline view and the polished modern decor, before her eyes finally landed on me. She let out a long breath, a smile spreading across her face as she walked toward my desk. I stood up to greet her, feeling a profound sense of mutual respect for the woman standing in front of me. We were no longer just two victims of a cruel, narcissistic family. We were the architects of their destruction, and we had both walked away from the wreckage stronger than ever before. "I hope you do not mind me dropping by unannounced," Heather said, taking the seat across from my desk. "I figured the front desk might turn me away if I did not mention the tracking receipts." "It was the perfect password," I replied, sitting back down and steepling my fingers. "It is good to see you, Heather. You look like you have been getting a lot of sleep lately." She laughed, a genuine relaxed sound that filled the quiet office. "You have no idea," she said, leaning back comfortably in the chair. "The air feels a lot cleaner when you remove all the toxic waste from your life." I nodded in agreement, understanding the feeling perfectly. The transition from living in a constant state of defensive anxiety to existing in a space of pure, unbothered peace was the greatest reward of all. Heather had proven her loyalty and her incredible intelligence when she gathered the evidence to dismantle the medical fraud ring. She had shown a level of strategic brilliance and quiet resilience that matched my own. She had not come to my office just to catch up on old times. A woman like Heather did not walk into a corporate headquarters without a clear, specific purpose. So I said, watching her carefully. "The dust has settled, the villains are bankrupt, and we both got exactly what we wanted. What brings you to my side of the city, Heather?" She looked at me, her eyes sharp and completely focused. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a sleek silver folder, setting it gently on the glass surface of my desk. She did not look nervous or hesitant. She looked like a woman ready to build her own empire. "I came to collect on a silent promise," she said simply. "I came to talk about my future." I opened the silver folder she slid across my desk, expecting to see a resume or a business proposal. Instead, the first document staring back at me was a finalized divorce decree bearing the heavy stamp of the state court. The name Malik was printed across the top as the respondent, and Heather's name sat proudly as the petitioner. I looked up from the legal document, a slow smile spreading across my face. She had actually done it. She had completely severed the rotting umbilical cord that tied her to that parasitic family. "I told him I was leaving the morning after the wedding raid," Heather explained, her voice steady and completely devoid of any regret. "He tried to pull the same manipulative tactics his mother always used. He told me I would be nothing without his family name. He told me I was making a massive mistake walking away from a man with his connections. But the funny thing about connections is that they are completely useless when your entire family is blacklisted by every major bank and political action committee in the city." Heather leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with the relaxed confidence of a woman who had just shed 200 pounds of dead weight. "The divorce was remarkably fast," she continued, "because he simply could not afford to fight me. Isaiah's financial ruin bled directly into Malik's accounts since they had foolishly co-signed on several luxury vehicles to keep up their wealthy facade. When the creditors came knocking for the cars, Malik was too busy dodging phone calls to contest the divorce settlement. His toxic aunts tried to intimidate me during the mediation process, calling me a traitor and a snake. But I simply reminded them that the federal prosecutors were still looking for co-conspirators in Brenda's church embezzlement scheme. They shut their mouths and disappeared very quickly after that. I walked away with my dignity, my savings, and absolutely zero ties to their bloodline. I nodded slowly, closing the silver folder and resting my hands on the glass surface of my desk. Walking away from poison is the first step, I said, my voice calm and professional. But building a new foundation is the actual challenge. You said you came to talk about your future, Heather. What exactly does that future look like to you? She did not hesitate. She reached into her designer tote bag one more time and pulled out a second folder. This one crisp white and perfectly organized. She handed it to me. I spent the last 5 years working silently in corporate management while dealing with the constant psychological warfare of my in-laws, she said. I know how to read people, Kiana. I know how to spot a liar, a manipulator, and a fraud from a mile away. I know how to build secure environments because I spent half a decade desperately trying to survive in a hostile one. She leaned forward, resting her hands on her lap. Your real estate development firm is expanding at an exponential rate. You are acquiring new properties, launching massive commercial projects, and hiring hundreds of new employees. You need an executive director of human resources who operates with absolute ruthless integrity. You need someone who will protect the culture of your empire with the exact same ferocity that you use to protect your children. I want that position, and I am the best person for the job. I opened the white folder and scanned the immaculate resume inside. Her credentials were flawless, having managed corporate restructuring for major logistics firms before her marriage to Malik sidelined her career. But her actual value went far beyond any corporate degree. Heather had demonstrated a level of loyalty and strategic brilliance that money simply could not buy. She had risked her own safety and her own marriage to mail me the DNA samples that saved my life. She had acted as a highly classified federal informant to dismantle a corrupt medical syndicate. She had stood in a ballroom full of angry high society elitists and confidently exposed the truth without a single tremor in her voice. She was sharp, she was fearless, and she was exactly the kind of woman I wanted standing by my side as I conquered the rest of the city. I closed the folder and looked her directly in the eyes, taking a moment to let the gravity of the situation settle between us. The corporate salary for the director position is well into the 6 figures, I stated, making sure she understood the magnitude of the offer. It comes with comprehensive executive benefits, stock options in the holding company, and a corner office on this exact floor. But the expectations are absolute. I do not tolerate corporate politics, and I do not entertain toxic behavior. We build empires here, Heather, and we do it with clean hands. Your first assignment will be implementing an ironclad corporate protection policy to ensure no one with a background like Isaiah or Vanessa's father ever makes it past our front lobby. Heather smiled, her eyes shining with fierce determination and deep, profound relief. I would not accept anything less, she replied. I extended my hand across the glass desk. Welcome to the firm, I said, our hands clasping in a firm, powerful shake that solidified our new alliance. We were no longer just survivors of the same nightmare. We were partners in a brand new reality. Just as our meeting concluded, a soft sound came from the private soundproof nursery attached to my office. The discreet wooden door was slightly ajar, and the quiet, happy babbling of my 3 sons drifted into the executive suite. Heather glanced toward the door, her smile softening completely, losing the sharp corporate edge from just a moment ago. Go ahead, I said, gesturing toward the nursery. They are just waking up from their morning nap. We walked together into the brightly lit nursery. It was a massive, beautiful space designed with the same modern elegance as the rest of the penthouse office. Plush, hypoallergenic carpets covered the hardwood floors and sunlight streamed through the thick, soundproof glass windows. My 3 boys were sitting on a massive luxury playmat surrounded by soft blocks and educational toys. They were healthy, vibrant, and deeply, deeply loved. Their amber brown eyes looked up as we entered, their faces breaking into identical bright smiles. Heather knelt down on the edge of the playmat, gently handing a soft blue block to the youngest boy. "They are so beautiful, Kiana," she whispered, watching them play with absolute peace. "They look so happy. They look so incredibly safe." I stood near the doorway, watching my children thrive in the exact environment their biological family had tried to deny them. They were completely untouched by the screaming, the manipulation, and the desperate greed that defined the people who shared their DNA. They would never know what it felt like to be looked at as a political prop or a financial burden. They would only ever know the absolute unconditional devotion of a mother who had reshaped the world just to ensure they had a soft place to land. 18 months ago, a cold clinic doctor and a cruel older woman had called me a barren, useless tree. Now I was looking at 3 perfect, vibrant lives that I had nurtured entirely on my own. I left Heather playing with the boys for a moment and walked slowly back into my main office. I walked past my heavy glass desk and stood right at the edge of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city of Atlanta stretched out infinitely before me, a massive, sprawling grid of glass steel and endless potential. The deep blue sky of the autumn morning provided a perfect backdrop for the towering skyscrapers. I placed my hand flat against the cool, thick glass, looking down at the busy streets below. Somewhere down there in the crowded, noisy city, the people who had tried to break me were struggling just to survive the day. Isaiah was sitting in a cramped cubicle watching his miserable paycheck get heavily garnished to fund the very empire he had mocked. Brenda was swiping barcodes at a register, terrified of making eye contact with her former friends. Vanessa was sitting in a small apartment, weeping over her father's federal prison sentence. They were all trapped in their own personal hells, entirely consumed by the consequences of their own toxic arrogance. But up here in the quiet, serene atmosphere of the penthouse, I felt nothing but pure, unadulterated freedom. For my entire life, I had been taught that family was strictly defined by blood. Society tells women to forgive, to smooth things over, to keep the peace, and to accept less than what they deserve, just to maintain the illusion of a happy family. We are conditioned to believe that we owe our loyalty to the people who share our genetics, regardless of how terribly they treat us, or how casually they discard us when we no longer serve their purpose. But looking out over the city that I was actively helping to build, I realized that everything I had been taught was a lie. Family has absolutely nothing to do with bloodlines or social status or keeping up appearances for the church elders. Family is about respect. It is about loyalty. Family is the people who stand by you when you hit absolute rock bottom and the entire world tells you that you are nothing. Family is the woman kneeling on my nursery floor playing with my sons because she chose to protect us when she had everything to lose. Family is the empire you build with your own 2 hands, surrounded by people who value your strength instead of fearing it. I thought back to that freezing day in the clinic parking lot when I had felt so incredibly small. I had thought my life was over because a weak, ambitious man told me I was a dead end. I had wept on the front lawn while a cruel, bitter woman threw my clothes into the dirt. They had tried to bury me under the weight of their own massive insecurities. They thought I would just disappear quietly into the background and let them live their fake wealthy lives completely undisturbed. They did not realize that when you try to bury a woman who knows her own worth, you are only planting a seed. I had taken their rejection, their cruelty, and their unbelievable arrogance, and I had used it as fuel to forge an unbreakable reality. I did not seek revenge by throwing physical punches or screaming in the streets. I sought the most devastating, permanent revenge possible. I simply became wildly, obscenely successful. I bought their venues, I exposed their crimes, and I took total, absolute control of my own narrative. I weaponized my pain and turned it into a multi-million-dollar portfolio that completely insulated me from their reach. I watched a massive crane moving slowly in the distance, constructing a new high-rise that my firm had just financed. The world was moving forward, and I was no longer a victim standing on the sidelines waiting for someone to validate my existence. I was the architect calling the shots and redesigning the skyline to fit my vision. I turned away from the breathtaking view and looked back toward the nursery, where the soft, happy laughter of my 3 sons was mingling with Heather's gentle voice. My heart felt incredibly full, completely devoid of any lingering anger or bitterness. The past was completely erased, washed away by the sheer magnitude of the beautiful, secure life I had created. I crossed my arms over my custom emerald green suit, a slow, deep smile spreading across my face. I took a deep breath of the cool, clean air circulating through the penthouse, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, absolutely free. The most powerful lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by the people who walk away from you. When Kiana was discarded and deemed useless, she didn't waste her energy begging for validation. Instead, she channeled her heartbreak into building an undeniable empire. True revenge isn't found in screaming matches or petty fights. It is found in massive, untouchable success and radical independence. Furthermore, family is not defined by bloodlines or social status, but by loyalty, respect, and who stands by you at rock bottom. You are the architect of your own destiny. Drop a comment below to share how you have turned a major setback into your biggest comeback. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering stories.